Not my revenge, but my professor against cheaters. I took the final for an engineering class this morning. Usually 1 or 2 people will go to the bathroom during class, however for totally unknown reasons, about half of the class needed to use the restroom during the exam. Obviously a vast majority of them were looking up the answers on their phones. This irritated me, but I just stayed focused and barely finished, since it was a hard exam. I remembered that there was one particular problem that was only barely related to the stuff we went over in class, where part A was fairly easy, but I had no idea how to do part B. I didn't fret over it too much though, since that part was only 5 points out of 100. Well, our professor, who is on the older side and I would have thought was somewhat ignorant of technology, sent us an email just now explaining his diabolical plan to catch cheaters. Many of the students in this class use Chegg, a website that has answers to lots of homework questions, if you're not familiar. To be fair, I have an account too, though I only used it for studying and checking homework solutions. Anyway, he explained that he was tired of people going to the bathroom and looking up answers on their phones, so he made the question I mentioned earlier as a trap. He purposely made part B impossible to solve, and about a month before the final, he got a tar with a Chegg account to ask the exact question, which was distinctly worded to be unique. He then created his own Chegg account and answered the question with a bullcrap solution that seems right at first glance, but is actually fundamentally flawed and very unlikely that someone would make the same assumptions and mistakes independently. He said that out of 99 exams, 14 of them fell for the trap, and that everyone who had his wrong solution on their exam was given a 0 and reported to the university for violating the academic honor pledge they signed on the front. He also sent an email to all the other professors in our department giving them the list of cheaters. Edit: I forgot to mention he gave full credit on part B of the question to everyone else. Vast majority of my profs have students turn in their phones and leave their bags at the front of the room during exams to prevent this exact scenario. I've had a couple classes where you can't leave whatsoever until you hand in the exam. I did witness an incident once following a lab practical exam. Earlier that year, the prof had mentioned that the exams stay roughly the same each year, which is why we aren't allowed to keep our graded practical sheets after learning of our scores. In the class following the exam, the prof took us in one by one to walk through our answers and get feedback on what we need to study. It went relatively quick with the exception of 3 or 4 students who walked out of the back room looking totally white in the face. Turns out said small group of students had tracked down a tar from last year and pulled money to buy the answer key from the tar. What they didn't know is that any tar who has worked with that professor is in on a scheme to catch cheaters, so they essentially revealed themselves even prior to taking the exam. Accordingly, the prof wrote 4 entirely new and unique exams only for those students who he was made aware of were trying to cheat. Needless to say, they failed the exams, were outed, and faced pretty gnarly academic punishment as a result. The reason for him writing 4 unique separate exams was he could tell who actually ended up trying to memorize and utilize the answer key. Of the 4 involved, only one of them remained in the class after that day, so I'm guessing he was the only one who had the brains to realize how stupid cheating that way was. He did, however, only score like a 65%. Prof made those 4 exams inordinately difficult, and it tanked his grade, so he did face some sort of fallout from the whole thing. I had a professor do something similar on a multiple choice exam, but he did it to the entire class and pretty much told us what the correct answers were before the exam. This was before smartphones. I graduated college in 03. Right before the exam started, he looked up and said, "Remember, when in doubt choose C." The correct answers were all C. He did this to determine who was willing to put the effort into his class and study. Those of us that studied were a little freaked out, but we turned in our tests. The others panicked and randomly changed their answers on some of the questions. It was the first and last time I ever got a 100% in any college level class on an exam. How in the world does this show who studied? It's flawed thinking by the professor in my opinion. In theory, if you studied and understood the material, you'd know that all C answers was correct and turn in the test that way. If you did not study, you would be certain that there is no way a professor would make a test where all the answers were the same, so you had to be wrong in places, which would make you pick non-C answers. In college, master's level heat transfer class, professor gave a problem where the differential equation was impossible to solve. The entire class of master's and PhD candidates came back with the same issue. Professor told all of us to go back and try again, twice. After the third week of trying, he came back and said he finally tried the problem himself and it was impossible to solve. Never felt more proud in my college career. I was a tar for a professor like that. He wrote the tests and homework the day before giving them to the students, so they weren't very polished. Half the questions ended up having 4 different possible answers, depending on what assumptions the student made. Grading those things took for goddamn ever. Kudos to you for taking the time to do your best. A customer decided to insult me and my coworkers during an IT support call. Recently found this sub and thought this story belonged here. TL. Doctor, I took a tech support call from a guest at a hotel who had to keep all of their possessions there temporarily due to a hurricane, and they were so profane and rude that I called the GM of the hotel who had them kicked out with nowhere to go. Some background. I work at a company that primarily supports hotel Wi-Fi, and taking calls from guests needing help connecting is part of that. Part of my job at the time of this happening was being an escalation point for unresolved guest problems. One time roughly 2 years ago, there was some huge hurricane going through Florida, so a lot of our hotels in Alabama and northern Florida were packed with people evacuating their homes. Most people staying at these hotels were bringing most of their possessions as well. Anyways, I got a message from the guest support team asking me to take a call from one of these guests from Florida, so I could help them connect the dozen or so devices they had to the Wi-Fi. For some reason they were refusing to connect, and tier 1 support couldn't resolve it. I start talking to the guy, and he is immediately hostile towards me, and gave the whole, I know what I'm doing, I'm tech savvy, shtick. I shrugged it off and, after about 30 minutes I was able to get every single one of his devices connected. After that he was still incredibly pissed off, and started ranting about how incompetent the employees he had been previously talking to were, and being upset at me that I took so long to get his crap connected too. I forget most of the profanity he was spewing at me, but I'll never forget him saying, "Your techs are worthless. You should hang them from their freaking intestines." At this point I should have just hung up on him, but I froze up a little and let him continue. He ended up insisting that I help him set up his Plex server, which is against the hotel's TOS, since he could potentially be using it to stream movies illegally. I finally got my manager involved, and we called the GM of the hotel and brought her up to speed while the guest was on hold. I got her conferenced into the call and immediately she began chewing him out and telling him he cannot talk to their support staff this way and that we had other more considerate guests to be assisting. He tried defending himself, telling her how long we took, but she was not having it, and told him he had 2 hours to get all of his belongings and leave or she would call the police. I'm not sure why she let me stay on the call for this long, but this guy begged her to let him stay, since he had just finished lugging everything he owned into his room, and every other hotel around was booked. She didn't budge however, and after scolding the guy some more she told me I could disconnect. Never in my life had I seen justice delivered so swiftly. This is the story I always tell people when talking about crazy support calls. Please remember this the next time you consider blowing up at tech support staff. This guy went from AAAAAAAA to Uno. Thanks Tabitha, you might not have a job tomorrow. That woman saw her entitlement blow up so hard we random strangers know all about it. Haha. Ha. I'm so happy someone made this reference. I'll be honest, I made these noises out loud. r/Talus from tech support might enjoy this too. Well, enjoy might not be the right word, perhaps be filled with comic satisfaction would fit better. How did I not know that this subreddit exists? This is awesome. Thanks. This was awesome. To top it off, while he may have ended up with a cot at the hotel motel with zero Wi-Fi, the manager would have rented his room in 10 minutes or mayo. In those conditions, make that 10 seconds. I bet she had a waiting list.